Alright guys, Dominic here for Kit Guru, and the OLED monitor reviews keep on coming as today we check out ASRock's first entry into this space with the Phantom Gaming PGO32UFS. Using LG's 32-inch WOLED panel, this screen's USP is the dual mode functionality, meaning it can run at either 4K 240Hz or 1080p 480Hz, with that latter mode promising exceptional motion clarity. Let's dive in then and find out exactly what this screen has to offer. It's definitely been a while since we last looked at a LG WOLED monitor, and the latest generation of this WOLED panel does offer a number of improvements over prior generations. The sub-pixel structure has been updated to provide better text clarity, for instance. Brightness has been increased, with ASRock claiming a peak of 1300 nits in HDR, while we have the aforementioned dual mode feature as well. Just a quick note on pricing though before we do dive into the review itself. I have seen it listed at just over £760 on AWD-IT, however it is currently out of stock, whereas in stock at OC UK and Scan it's more like £840, £850, so pricing does seem a little in the air, but more on that later in the video. Starting first with the design though, I must say I was a bit disappointed to see ASRock carrying over essentially the same core design that we saw on the budget PG-32UFS that I reviewed last year. There's nothing objectively wrong with it, it just looks and feels quite cheap to me given it's made entirely of matte black plastic. It's also surprisingly light at barely 6 kilos, which doesn't make the best first impression. Again, it works fine and it's not hideous, but if you're paying at least £760 for a premium 4K OLED monitor, I really would expect to see a metal stand and a slightly more refined overall design. ASRock has also included 2 RGB strips on the back of the monitor which are configurable within the OSD, but they're not a patch on the Philips ambigular lighting that we saw recently with the Evnia 27M2N 8500. As for the included stand, this offers up to 100mm of height adjust, 20 degrees with swivel both left and right, and then tilt from -7 to +20 degrees. That does mean that there's no pivot support, but I think that's more forgivable on a bigger monitor like this, plus VESA 100x100 mounts are supported. ASRock is also persisting with its built-in Wi-Fi antenna feature that we first saw on that PG-27QFT2A. It might be a value add for some, but it's not something I'd personally use. We can also note the OSD joystick on the back right corner of the screen with a power button above it and the dual mode button below it. The dual mode functionality itself is super straightforward. You simply press the button to switch from 4K 240 to 1080p 480 or vice versa. It does take a few seconds, so it's not instant, but it worked every time without a hitch in my testing, and we will talk about this later on in the video. As for ports and connectors then, these are split across 2 main banks. Over on the right hand side we have the video inputs with 2 DisplayPort 1.4 and 2 HDMI 2.1, alongside the USB-C which does support DP-Alt mode and 65 watts power delivery. Next for that is a USB Type-A used for updating firmware, an audio jack and the power input. On the left hand side we have a Type-B upstream which feeds 3 Type-A downstream ports running at 5 gigabits per second. As for the OSD itself, this is fine overall. It's very easy to navigate with the joystick, and ASRock has included a fair selection of features. That said, I don't like the fact that there's just no way to customize quick shortcuts via the joystick. There's worryingly small amounts of anti-burn-in features too. Some of the settings are also slightly confusing given there's an sRGB mode in the image setup tab, but it doesn't actually clamp the gamut unless you also adjust the color space option, which is found in the picture submenu. And I think you can still tell ASRock is still relatively new to the monitor space, as there's definitely room for streamlining here. Just before we do move on to panel performance however, there are the usual OLED quirks that we need to discuss in this video, the first of which is going to be the sub-pixel structure. Now for this generation LG has improved this area, moving from an RWBG layout to RGWB, and this does improve fringing hugely, which coupled with the 4K resolution means for me it was a total non-issue, whereas the older 27-inch 1440p OLEDs were quite poor in this regard. The panel still has a strong anti-glare coating though, which does seem to divide opinion on OLED monitors. It does minimise reflections really well, but there is also some visible coating grain, which you don't get on semi-glossy QD-OLEDs for instance. Of course, as with any OLED, there is also the potential risk for burn-in, and as we said, ASRock doesn't include loads of features to help mitigate this. We do find Pixel Clear, which is the usual pixel refresh option that happens every few hours. Then there's Pixel Move, also known as Pixel Shift, where the display rotates slowly over time. And finally, Logo Dimming, which is designed to dim static elements on screen. If you compare that to other OLED monitors we've reviewed recently, it really doesn't seem that comprehensive a list, and we've also had to ask ASRock to clarify the exact situation in regards to the warranty and burn-in cover, as it isn't shown anywhere on the PGO32UFS product page, which I do find slightly worrying. Just a quick interruption on that video though, guys. After filming, I did actually get confirmation from ASRock that the PGO32UFS does actually have a 3-year warranty, and that does include burn-in control, so forget what I just said, it is covered. I do also want to quickly address the firmware update situation as well, as I think this is another area ASRock needs to improve on. As mentioned, there is a Type A USB port on the monitor itself, which you can use to update the firmware, which you can download from a section on the product page on ASRock's website. However, within the OSD, there's just no way of knowing which firmware you're currently running. In fact, you actually have to access the factory menu on the monitor itself to be able to find out which firmware is currently being used, and I didn't even know this myself until it was pointed out to me by Simon from TFT Central, so shout out Simon for that. But basically, to access the factory menu, you have to press in the joystick with the monitor off, then turn the monitor on, release the joystick, press it in again, and then the factory menu will appear. And we can see at the very top it does say V12, which is what it showed after I updated the firmware. This obviously isn't a deal breaker, but I just think ASRock needs to make it clear within the main OSD itself which version of the firmware is currently being used, so you know if you need to update or not.
If you're looking for a new chair, then definitely go and check out boolies.co.uk. They offer a whole host of gaming and office chairs that come in a variety of different finishes and different colours.
That's it though for all of that kind of extra stuff, and now we're going to move on to our actual panel testing. And as a reminder, here we do use Portrait Display's Calman Ultimate with an X-Rite i1 Display Pro Plus colorimeter. Starting with default brightness then, this is fairly typical of an OLED monitor with a range from 20.2 nits up to 227.5 nits. This, however, is using the default low peak brightness setting, and there is actually a high peak brightness option that you can toggle on. The high peak brightness mode does raise overall peak brightness, as the name suggests, up to 409 nits for the 1 to 10% APLs. However, the auto brightness limiter, or ABL, also kicks in after that, reducing brightness to 250 nits for a full screen white, and that is typical of an OLED monitor. Using the low peak brightness mode, however, doesn't result in any dimming as the window size increases, but it also doesn't get quite so bright at the 100% setting, though the difference is only 22 nits according to my measurements. As for gamut testing though, this far exceeds the sRGB space and registers 97.4% DCI-P3 coverage, alongside 94.2% Adobe RGB and 71.7% reporting for Rec 2020. It may not be quite as wide as the QD-OLED monitors we've reviewed recently, but it is still very wide overall. Moving on though to default grayscale performance, this isn't terrible, but it does leave a fair bit to be desired, given the colour balance has a slight green tint to it, while gamma is also higher than intended, averaging 2.332 over our testing. This results in an average grayscale delta E 2000 of 3.08, which is not diabolical, but there's clearly room for improvement. What's fascinating though is that the manual colour balance setting in the OSD actually changes default gamma behaviour. It's like an entirely different mode which I don't think I've ever seen before, so by enabling this mode and simply reducing the red channel from 100 to 97, not only do we get near perfect colour balance, but the gamma tracking is absolutely miles better, resulting in a new average grayscale delta E 2000 of just 0.86. Exactly why these settings aren't the default option out of the box is an absolute mystery to me. After all, ASRock has done the work to get almost flawless gamma tracking in there, but it's tucked away in the OSD in a way that many people will never find, and I think that's another area that goes to show the company's relative inexperience in this market space. Moving on to the saturation sweeps though, we see a good chunk of oversaturation relative to the sRGB space as expected. Things do look better compared to the DCI-P3 space with an average delta E 2000 of 2.37. The same also goes for colour accuracy relative to sRGB is okay, but clearly hampered by the very wide gamma on offer. DCI-P3 results are again better, hitting an average delta E 2000 of 2.56, but it's nothing mind-blowing. As mentioned though, ASRock does include the sRGB mode, and it's pretty well configured overall. The gamma is clamped reasonably well, colour balance is still slightly too warm, but gamma tracking is pretty good. Saturation and colour accuracy are also significantly better though, each averaging delta E 2000s of around 1.4, so it's definitely worth using this mode if you are working or viewing sRGB content. Of course, the best results are only possible after calibration, where we saw almost perfect colour balance and excellent gamma tracking too, while saturation and colour accuracy are even better still. Again, if you do have the tools for calibration, it is well worth doing. Moving on though from colour testing to response times and motion clarity, given the PGO32UFS is an OLED and we know what to expect from an OLED in terms of response times, I haven't done a whole heap of testing here, but at 4K 240Hz it averages 0.86 milliseconds for the response times, which is exactly as we'd expect. Just to make sure there was no funny business going on, I also tested the 1080p 480Hz mode and the average response time was still just 0.9 milliseconds, so that's about as good as it gets right now. The refresh rate though obviously has a huge implication for overall motion clarity, so to demonstrate that I tested at 120, 240, 360 and 480 Hz. It really is fascinating how good 240 Hz looks on an OLED when viewed in isolation, but how bad it looks compared to the same thing running at 480 Hz. There's no other way to say it, 480 Hz motion clarity on an OLED is absolutely insane and by far the best I've ever seen. Is it a huge jump over 360 Hz? No, but I do think the difference is definitely perceptible and it is a good chunk clearer than 240 Hz. The thing about the dual mode setting, however, is that the 480 Hz refresh rate obviously limits you to 1080p resolution, and 1080p over a 32-inch or technically 31.5-inch screen size results in a pixel density of just 70 pixels per inch compared to 140 pixels per inch when using 4K resolution. Now, that results in a strange situation where you can have absurdly good motion clarity in the 1080p 480Hz mode, but equally a lack of overall detail and sharpness in the image compared to 4K, which is a bit of a strange phenomenon. I particularly noticed this actually when I was playing Rocket League, where I was sitting at 480 FPS most of the time. The motion clarity around my car was absolutely superb to the point where it almost didn't look any different whether it was moving or not. But I also couldn't escape the feeling that the whole image was just too soft and pixelated overall. It also doesn't help that ASRock hasn't included any modes to reduce the screen size when using the 1080p 480Hz mode, like we've seen from LG. To be clear though, the dual mode functionality itself is absolutely worth having. There's really no downside to having the option. If you're anything like me, you'll stick with the 4K 240Hz mode for the combination of detail and fluidity, but the 1080p 480Hz mode may appeal to others. You still got all the usual benefits of an OLED for gaming too, including the perfect contrast, wide gamut for a punchy and saturated image, alongside the super fast response times, which means zero visible ghosting. Just let me know in the comments which of these two modes you would personally use. One really fascinating of testing, however, has proved to be input lag, where we're focused on the on-display lag. This is slightly higher using the 4K 240Hz mode, averaging 6.32 milliseconds, so about a frame and a half at 240Hz, where each frame refreshes at 4.17 milliseconds. For context, other QD-OLED 240Hz monitors we've tested average more like 1.8 to 2 milliseconds, so this is definitely higher than expected. That also carries over to the 480Hz mode, which averages 3.36 milliseconds, again about a frame and a half of latency at that refresh rate. Now, I'm absolutely not nearly good enough a gamer to actually notice the difference. We're talking very fine margins overall, but it's still something I think ASRock could look into with a future firmware update.
With 20 years of PC manufacturing experience, CyberPower PC are the best in the business. With the largest range of parts available in the UK, our team of experienced builders will expertly build and test each system to be delivered to you the very next day. Check out cyberpowersystem.co.uk.
HDR is a big part of this screen too, and the first thing you need to know is that ASRock is offering 3 HDR modes. We've got True Black 400, HDR Game and HDR Movie. HDR Game and HDR Movie proved almost identical in my testing, so I'm focusing instead on the HDR Game and the True Black 400 modes. In terms of brightness, it goes about how you'd expect. The True Black 400 mode is much dimmer, hitting a peak of just under 430 nits, whereas the HDR Game is significantly brighter, peaking out 1244 nits in my testing, though only for the 1% APL, and it quickly drops off as the window size increases, though that is perfectly normal for OLED screens. As for grayscale testing using our default 10% APL, the True Black 400 mode looks very well configured with very accurate EOTF tracking. The HDR Game mode is technically less accurate given its EOTF curve is actually slightly too bright, especially towards the end of the curve, but some users may prefer this image. Comparing the EOTF tracking across a range of window sizes, however, the True Black 400 mode is generally solid, though it does actually roll off slightly at the 25% and 50% APLs. The HDR Game mode also rolls off at a 50% APL, but not so aggressively as the True Black 400 option, and it is still generally brighter than intended. Again, it's not technically accurate, but I do actually think that most people would prefer that presentation from a subjective perspective, especially when you factor in that it has much higher peak brightness as well. Just to illustrate the differences in practice, here you can see those two modes running side by side. Again, OLED works absolutely fantastically well for HDR due to the per-pixel nature of the panel, meaning no haloing or blooming, and the blacks are proper black, unlike on an LCD. As I said, I'd personally use the HDR game mode myself, but let me know if you agree or not down in the comments. That brings us then to the end of this video, and as the company's first entry in the OLED market space, I'd say ASRock's PGO32UFS does a fair number of things well, but it also has its fair share of weaknesses. Starting off with the good though, by utilising LG's latest generation WOLED panel, this monitor delivers superb response times, infinite contrast, and a very wide gamut, making it an excellent choice for gaming. Its HDR gets plenty bright too and is fairly accurate, while the matte coating will appeal to those who want to minimise reflections. One of its biggest features though is the dual mode functionality, where the screen can run at either 4K 240 or 1080p 480Hz. Having this versatility at the literal press of a button is a really good inclusion, as you can have the crisp sharpness of 4K but quickly switch to 480Hz for the all-out motion clarity it provides. Personally speaking, I did find the 1080p resolution over the 32-inch panel size to look very soft and lacking detail, but there's absolutely no harm in having the option, depending on the games you're playing. There are a few clear areas for ASRock to improve on though, the main one being factory calibration. It's not really that bad, being slightly greenish and with gamma that's a bit higher than intended, but it seems bonkers to me that there's actually a setting that enables basically perfect gamma tracking when using a manual colour balance, and that is not enabled by default. It's one of those things which I think goes to show the company's relative inexperience in this market segment, as they've done the work to include the mode, but then buried it in the OSD where a lot of people may never find it. The same goes for the OSD itself, which is fine but slightly confusingly laid out at times, with an sRGB mode that seemingly does nothing positioned in one submenu, and another sRGB mode that actually clamps the gamut hidden away in another tab. There's also only 3 anti-burn-in features too, when other screens from the likes of Asus and MSI offer several more. My final bone of contention is around the design and build quality too, as this screen is very plasticky and we'd certainly expect better from something targeting this market segment. That said, I do think there are enough pros that outweigh the cons, and that is especially true if you can find it at the lower price of £760. Right now, as I said though, it is currently out of stock at that price on AWD-IT, and the likes of OC UK and Scan have it for more like £840, £850, at which point I do think it becomes a much tougher sell, considering 4K 240Hz QD-OLEDs are also around at that price. However, it is still worth buying, as I said, especially if you're interested in the dual mode functionality, as that really is this screen's unique selling point. Anyway guys, that is where I'm going to leave this video, so if you liked it, please do toss me a thumbs up, and as always, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Please do subscribe if you haven't already, and be sure to ding that notification bell so you don't miss when we upload a new video. If you want to carry on the conversation as well, you can find a link to our Discord server down in the description, and while there you'll also find links to our merch store and our Patreon if you'd like to consider helping us out that way. That is it for this one though guys, I'm Dominic for Kit Guru, and I'll see you in the next video.